fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
White people don't want to work anymore. We can't get them to do a hard day's work. These young people, they don't want to work. We need to hire immigrants. We need migrants. We need Mexicans. We need Indians. We need all these people because white people don't want to do the jobs anymore. I think we are emerging into a new narrative where it's white people don't want to reproduce anymore. Furthermore, that whiteness and that white America is hostile to the family. And this is something the GOP has, I believe, fully internalized. And people will look at the Republicans and the conservatives and say, wow, they seem to be really into Hispanics these days. They seem to be really into these other demographics. They don't really seem to be into white people anymore because I think they have looked at the stats. And if we do believe that demographics are destiny, and they are, they look at the white birth rates correctly. Are they flatlining or falling? They look at these other groups that are expanding in their birth rates, and they're placing a bet. And their bet is on in their mind, the more pro-natal side. And I think within a few years, we will see the narrative twist a little bit more, that white people are not only not hardworking, they don't even want to reproduce. And this is where this thing called the Great Replacement becomes celebrated. It becomes celebrated, and white people start getting mocked for not even want to fuck each other anymore, not even wanting to have families. And in fact, keep an eye out for this. Look, I'm doing what I'm not supposed to do. I'm making a prediction, but keep your mind open when you hear this, that if there is a larger pushback against woke culture, specifically the LGBT element of it, it will be successfully staged from Hispanic Catholicism and the Muslims. And upon their victory, all of this woke LGBT shit will be blamed on white people. It already kind of is. The trans phenomena, even though there are there's more black transgender people than white ones, largely this LGBT shit is getting blamed on white people. And if there ever is a pushback, my concern is that a lot of the most egregious shit will be blamed on like white people. That it was never the minorities who wanted this stuff. They were tricked by white people. And that will be the final nail in the coffin of sort of the anti-natalism of whiteness, that they've been pushing homosexuality on the poor minorities this entire time, the minorities that now outnumber the whites. And I think that is something I haven't really talked about or really prepared for. And what I'm trying to say is that, back to the main point, we're going to be the last generation of people who want to talk about the interesting stuff. Our demographic, if it does die out, get ready for the Fast X West. Like you as the meta conversation won't get to exist anymore. And I think that actually is important, because I think that opens your mind. We'll be living in a demographically tilted world where no one's discussing anything interesting anymore. They'll only be discussing materialistic stuff, and it's only going to be like food and water and shit. But then I don't know. That's the more I looked at it, I was just reminded of that poster of like, this is the rising tide. It's not just migrants. It's the birth rate, and it is what I believe is going to be a true anti-white celebration that's going to like grind the remaining morale of our side into the dust. And I actually don't know what to do about that. And that's what I'm just saying. Like, this is something that I see happening.
And it's interesting to use the New Yorker cover as an indication of that. I don't know if you'd seen the original, but the artist, after this blew up, the artist had posted their original drafts of the illustration, not the ones that were used, but the earlier drafts. And the earlier drafts actually do show a family for the MAGA-pede, for the right winger. It shows a father and a daughter. And then they decided that they didn't want that version. They wanted the version where the family wasn't there, and they have the guy casting a wayward glance over his shoulder at an empty truck. So like, don't think for a minute that this isn't on their minds as well. Like, this isn't just us being conspiracy theorists. This is already a narrative, even though it isn't their primary narrative. We're going in that direction. I mean, what do you think? Like 5 years, 10 years before they start playing hard into this, or what? Not to make a prediction, but like, do you think we're close to it?
I think so, because the way I see them talk about, at one point in the past they would talk about white people, and then they switched over the past, I'd say, 10 years to sort of an academic deconstruction of whiteness. And that, see, in their minds, that allows them to permit themselves to use overtly hostile language, like we need to destroy whiteness. But the trick there is that if whiteness is something that needs to be destroyed, white people, once you dehumanize them, they're just avatars of whiteness. You've removed the white people from the conversation entirely. You just have whiteness and these people that seem to embody whiteness, but they're less than people in their views. And if people will post these articles from like The Root or something like that, where it's black people calling for white genocide, and
Yeah.
that's just one website. I'm like, there was a time where one website would fucking be enough.
Yeah.
There is a time where if there was one news article calling for all white people to die, it would be a national fucking uproar.
It's an interesting way to frame it as well. And you're absolutely right that they dehumanize us and they detach the concept of whiteness from us as a race, and they make it a philosophical issue, and we're just the avatars. And they destroy the avatars, but even after we're gone, they'll still want to destroy whiteness. And maybe it's very liberal of me, but the bigger tragedy seems to be the destruction of whiteness in the abstract, not of our race. Because I mean, it's because I'm a white supremacist. I don't think I'm a white supremacist, but like most of what makes the world great are the things that they've decided fall into the category of whiteness. Like most of what we qualify as like civilization and progress is whiteness. So it's one thing if they exterminate us racially, but it's another thing if they say like coming to work on time and algebra is is whiteness. Like shit, man, are you serious?
That's where you get the spiteful mutant hypothesis going in there, and sort of the dysgenic. Like, there's a lot of different components to this, but yeah, that's maybe that's a bummer to end on. I just wanted to talk because there's still people talking about that cover and what it means, but I don't think there's a way to interpret that without a demographic angle. Some people will look at it as the positive, that they look at the family on the right and they think that's white, so it's like a new, we're separating the wheat from the chaff. We're getting rid of
the
deplorables.
We can agree a minimum interpretation would be that it's like, which way Western man type question. But like I agree with you also that it's very, not only is it specific that if you draw it right down the middle, you have values represented on the left. So if we're going to say 1985 Ford with a double barrel shotgun, MAGA, NRA, and Christ, and a rusted tailgate, that's one side. Well, what's on the other side? Outdoor activities, minivan, and a family with TFR, a family with replacement of one minimum. Like almost the centerpiece of the right-hand column is family. So if you think this is a political statement, and we know from the previous draft that it is because they edited it to make it look like this is not only includes themes of anti-natality, it actually, that's probably the primary theme. So
yeah, and my fear is that, and I think some people kind of know this, a lot of people on the right, especially the white nationalist types, would do like they'll miss us when we're gone. Like once we have a competence crisis right now. I'm like, I'm sure there's a competence crisis. Everything's going to suck once white people aren't allowed to run everything. Yeah. But I'm like, yeah, but that's South America. South America is still there.
Yeah.
So people talk about the Brazilification of America. I'm like, yeah, that's probably going to happen. There's still Brazil. But it's just, so we'll have Brazil, but more nukes, and you'll probably have a few white guys will be touting around saying, I get to be in New Hampshire. But this kind of reminds me of it, but like overall, it's going to get way shittier, and there's going to be no period where anyone's going to say, I really miss white people being here, because at that point you're going to be so fucking demonized that you're going to be afraid to say that's what you are. You're gonna grope from like, I'm not white, I'm Creole.
And again, I know we're supposed to be really callous towards them, but it is kind of a white man's burden thing. Like, I don't want the world to look like that. I don't want them to suffer. I certainly don't want to suffer, and I don't want my family and my race to suffer. But like, I don't want the world to have a competency crisis. You know what I mean? Like, we don't just want jobs because we feel disenfranchised. We want jobs because we miss the days when the world actually worked correctly. Like, I miss the buses being on time. Don't you? Like, I don't care what race you are. Don't you miss the buses being on time? And even if you don't, I'm wishing that for you. You know, maybe you don't even understand the value of the buses and trains running on time, but I do, and it is good for you. So I'm trying to bring it back. Fuck,
You know what's
man.
interesting? This actually gels with the book I wanted to talk about. And I'd like to talk about now. I think it's relevant, especially the part I'm going to talk about right at the start. I'm going to try and get this out. It's a pretty short book, and that's why I think I could fit it in. I was going to pair this with another much longer book. I'm just going to save that one until the next episode. But it's a launching point. This book right now is a launching point to the next one. The book is called Heartland, 3 Essays on Geopolitics by Halford Mackinder. And Halford Mackinder is a very famous geopolitical thinker. It says Halford Mackinder's ideas have shaped the international politics to this day, and his concept that world domination depends on the control of a global pivot area or heartland, the center of the large landmass of Europe and Asia, has informed the political tactics and wars in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe throughout the decades. So it's a very, very short book, but it touches on a lot of stuff we were just talking about and new ways to conceptualize the power structure of geopolitics, because we're continuing on the what I call our geopolitics arc right now. It started with the previous 2 books on China, and it's related to an earlier book we discussed by John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So I would encourage people to go back and listen to that clip, because offensive realism has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about now. Sort of almost not post-national, but in a way post-national. It's understanding the conflicts of the world, not just from the perspective of conflicts between nations, but sort of these broader power structures that seem to have their roots deeper in human history. And we're really going to get into that next episode, but this one kind of sets it up. So he starts off by saying something really interesting here. He says, even though European conquest seems to define the world, and this would have been written in the early 20th century, a lot of these books on geopolitics were pretty old that we're going to get into, early 20th century, mid 20th century, but they're still relevant. He says, even though European conquest defines the world, especially in the modern globalized area, European history historically was subordinate to Asiatic history. And we kind of got into this when we were talking about the Mongols, when we were talking about the Huns. And I think over the past few episodes, we've made a case that even though a lot of historians like to focus on the West, even guys like Spengler and even guys like Julius Evola, they took a wider scope and had us look more at India and more at Asia.
Subordinate is a pretty strong word, though.
He was saying that in the sense that Europe was basically forced to unify against Asiatic invasion. That's the angle he was taking.
In one period of history, yeah.
Well, he was saying that is the Mongol invasion. Like a lot of, and that is also the Vikings are not Asiatic, but in the same way that the Vikings forced England to unify, this is where we also get the Islamic Jihad and the reaction of the Crusades, and then the pushback against the Mongols and so the claim he's making that oftentimes it was Asian encroachment into Europe that forced Europe to kind of unify in ways that Europe has always found it difficult to unify. And when it has unified, it's been against an exterior invasion. It says, a repellent personality performs a valuable social function in uniting his enemies, and it was under the pressure of external barbarism that Europe achieved her civilization. I ask you, therefore, for a moment to look upon Europe and European history as subordinate to Asia and Asiatic history, for European civilization is, in a very real sense, the outcome of the secular struggle against Asiatic invasion. That's in short. And I think...
Okay, no, I agree with that. That does make sense, actually.
Yeah. It says, as in the case of Europe, so in other marginal lands of Eurasia, there are records of earlier invasions. China had more than once to submit to conquest from the north. India several times to conquest from the northwest. In the case of Persia, however, at least one of the earlier descents has a special significance in the history of Western civilization. 3 or 4 centuries before the Mongols, the Seljuk Turks, emerging from Central Asia, overran by this path an immense area of the land, which we may describe as the 5 Seas. seas: Caspian, Black, Mediterranean, Ked, and Persian. They established themselves as Kerman at Hamad. The hordes, which ultimately fell upon Europe in the middle of the 14th century, gathered their first force 3,000 miles away on the high steppes of Mongolia. The havoc wrought for a few years in Poland, Silesia, Moravia, Hungary, Croatia, and Serbia was, however, but the remotest and the most transient result of the great stirring of the nomads of the East, associated with the name of Genghis Khan. So, we discussed this at length with the Mongols, but, I think it's important to remind ourselves that a lot of this history of Eastern Europe is like butting up right against this, like, centuries upon centuries of invasion, which also helped define Russia to this day.
English geographer Halford Mackinder developed the Heartland theory. In this theory, he divided up the world into 3 parts: the world island, offshore islands, and outlying islands. The world island, or Heartland as they call it, is an area with the most resources and natural defenses. Mackinder theorized that Eastern Europe controlled the world island, and therefore the world's power came from that region.
Essentially, what he's saying in this book is that in geopolitics, there's this thing called the Heartland theory. And the Heartland theory, I think if you look at a lot of the geopolitical heavy hitters these days, they still operate with this model in mind. It's the belief that within Eurasia, this massive landmass of Eurasia, there's this place called the Heartland, and the control of the Heartland is essential. And Russia historically has always been the dominant force in the region.
The thesis divides the supercontinent into 2 regions, the Inner Crescent, or Rimlands, and the Heartland. The Rimlands, consisting of Arabia, Western Europe, India, and East Asia, make up only 1/5 of the world island's area, but house 4/5 of its population. Using Mackinder's earlier logic, this region ought to be the place from which to attempt world island domination. And indeed, Mackinder freely admits that in his day, the Rimlands were the more powerful part of the world island. This was because the period from 1500 to 1900 saw great advances in naval technology. Better ships let coastal Rimlanders travel faster and farther than anything on land, giving them large strategic flexibility. This meant that Rimlanders could bypass defenses, strike rear areas, and wreak havoc before land powers could even respond. Thus able to choose their battles, Rimland powers during this period had nothing to fear from land armies, and could therefore create their empires with little risk. But even then, the Rimlands could not dominate the world island. After all, they had not touched the Heartland.
And so there's this idea, especially if people just started paying attention to politics right now, that animosity towards Russia is kind of a new thing, a random thing, or a materialist thing, or some kind of echo of Soviet hostility, when, as we'll see in the next episode, we've been fighting against Russia for centuries, and more so in Europe. But the idea, Russia is a very unique and distinct entity. It's both a nation and a civilization, whereas a lot of nations would be part of a larger civilization. But Russia, as we know it, is like this huge chunk just right there. And it's always vied for control of sort of the surrounding area in the steppes and the Middle East and these other countries. And there's this idea that whoever controls this sort of frontier middle area controls the entire continent. And control of that entire continent has never really been achieved, although it was almost achieved. There's been some attempts to achieve it. That is what the Soviets attempted to do. That is what Napoleon attempted to do. If you look at a lot of the people wonder, why are there so many fucking wars for the Middle East? Why does anyone care about the Middle East? And people will say it's oil. Not really. People will say it's for other resources. Not really. It's just there's always been a war for this region. There's never not been a war for this fucking region. And this region itself has always been kind of pushing back and invading Western Europe. So in a sense, it's sort of like the same power struggle that's been occurring for like 1,000 years. And that's a completely different way to look at it than what a lot of people are used to. It exists outside of our nationalist understanding of things.
Control over this area means control of the world island, the most resource-rich and populous of the three regions. Control of the world island means control of the entire world. Since Russia covers most of the Heartland, this puts Moscow in a very strategically advantageous position, much to the frustration and alarm of the current global hegemon, that is, the USA and its European vassals. According to Mackinder, the struggle is between the oceanic seafaring power bloc, also known as the Atlanticists, or the Anglo-American establishment, which occupy the offshore and outlying islands, and the continental land powers of Prussia, Germany, and Russia.
According to physical confirmation, these regions are 4 in number, and it is not a little remarkable that in a general way they respectively coincide with the spheres of the 4 great religions: Buddhism, Brahmanism, Mohammedanism, and Christianity. And what's interesting is that historically the great conflict has been between Europe and Russia, where Europe, especially Britain, represented naval power, untouched naval power, and Russia historically has always represented land power, and it never really developed naval power, except in the next episode we'll get into certain incursions into the Black Sea. But when you talk about like Europe versus Russia, you are almost talking about sea versus land, and to this day and we're seeing this in the war in Ukraine, people are still struggling against the complete and total land power of Russia. And it's kind of interesting how Russia came to be, because it all comes down to geography. If you look at like a lot of the geopolitics really comes down to geography, where the land mass is divided by mountains. If you look at how Russia is laid out, it's kind of bookended. It's sequestered in the north. So internally, it's kind of blocked off from a lot of outside forces. And the argument was made that it permitted a lot of expansion within itself, and not a lot of people wanted to invade Russia, so it is able to create this sort of distinct identity for itself on such a scale that everything around it couldn't even contest with it. Because Russia is really bordered on all sides by conquestable areas, and having, just like China is always up against its enemies. It's always up against the Mongols and the steppes. But China historically took a defensive position, and Russia historically took a way, way more offensive position. It was always trying to invade. It was always trying to push back and bring in more territory and kind of define what they call the optimum of conquest. Like, how far can you expand before it actually doesn't make sense that you can expand, where the pushback is too great. He says, it is probably one of the most striking coincidences of history that the seaward and the landward expansion of Europe should, in a sense, continue the ancient opposition between Roman and Greek. Few great failures have had more far-reaching consequences than the failure of Rome to Latinize the Greek. The Teuton was civilized and Christianized by the Roman. The Slav is the main by the Greek. It is the Roman Teuton who, in later times, embarked upon the ocean. It was the Greco-Slav who rode over the steppes, conquering the Turanian. Thus, the modern land power differs from the sea power no less in the source than its ideals than in the material conditions of its mobility. Basically, what he's saying is that the civilizational difference in like Europe versus Russia goes back to ancient Rome. That there's a great diversion of these great civilizations, and that the Slavic mindset developed as like a uniquely land-based thing, and then, you know, the Roman mindset developed into more of a seafaring thing, and the opposition between sort of this heartland area of Russia and Europe is so distinct that it's like a religious division in itself. And we'll get into this later when we talk about the Clash of Civilizations and Remaking the World Order by Samuel Huntington. But it's like, you know, this division between Russia and Europe has always existed, and it's on almost like a biological level. Because some people say like, oh, Russia's kind of like European. It's like, it's so different, it's insane. And it's almost like there can really be no collaboration. It's to the point where you have to look at Europe and America as a Western civilization, and Russia can never it can never be it can never be part of Western civilization. It's always destined to be in conflict with the West, and this is a fight that's been going back like 1,000 years. It's a war over the same, what they call a pivot area, this like crescent of nations around Russia and around Europe and the in-between, and fighting for that area. The control of the pivot area defines who controls the entirety of Eurasia. This is essentially what we're talking about here. So when you look at the war in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine might not make a lot of sense to people if you're really looking at it from the bird's eye view. You could talk about, it's a political thing, but really what it is, it's a war over a pivot area. And people will kind of get a notion that it's NATO expansion. Yes, it is NATO expansion. But what is NATO expansion? Well, it's European expansion. And at the same place it's been expanding for like 500 years to contain Russia, because we live in a world of offensive realism where Russia is always going to expand.
The thesis starts with a simple observation. After 1900, there would be no more empty political space in the world. All lands would now be politically connected to some degree, with political events in London having consequences in China and South America. This much was obvious in the age of imperialism, but what was less obvious was that the relationship also held in reverse, with political events in South America or China having an impact on Europe. The thesis argues against regional politics. Politicians cannot be concerned simply about the balance of power in Europe or East Asia. They have to consider these things on the global scale, if only because there was one region, generally ignored by leaders on the eve of World War I, that held the key to world domination.
And that's something I'd like to kind of say here. Like when the Heartland theory is what guides most geopolitical thinking on a base level. It is this understanding that you're living in a fantasy world if you think that Russia is just going to be chill. And I'm not anti-Russian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not pro-NATO. We've established that on the show. But Russia knows that Europe is going to be expanding into this sort of pivot area, this crescent area of these other nations in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the same war over centuries. And then Europe knows that Russia is going to be trying to control them too, either militarily through conquest or through economic means, or through the control of the elites. That's happened in the past. That was happening like the 16 and 1700s. Russia was like funding dissident movements. It's the same thing that's been happening for hundreds of years. It's the same war, but it's like this NATO versus Russia thing is never going to end. It's the same fucking war. And first of all, what do you think of what I'm saying so far? Some of it might be a lot of information being thrown at you, but what do you think about this so far?
No, I like it. I kind of agree. It reminds me of Mackinder's what is it, The Great Game, or I forget what it's called, but yeah, this idea that there's a couple of core spaces and civilizations that have been more or less constant, regardless of language or name or whatever, for thousands of years, and we haven't figured that out. So it is funny to hear people talk about Russia as if they're almost part of Europe or something.
Yeah, it's. You have to step back and look at the map of the world as like this huge chunk is a pivot area. Then there's the internal crescent around it. And it's a war for these key areas. And these key areas, they have the resources, they have the people, but they have the trade routes. These trade routes are important. But you have to realize that whoever controls this area essentially controls the world in a lot of ways. Like whoever has dominance in this sort of crescent of power can make everything else fall around it. And right now there is sort of a rough civilizational balance between them. And this is kind of what I was getting at. It's like the way to conceptualize this war of the pivot area is like you have there is no America. People are like, oh, America, Europe is in the American sphere of influence. That's true. There's only the West. There's this broad civilizational empire. People call it the Greater American Empire. They call it the Gay. They call it Atlanticism. It's the West. The West is one holistic civilization. The question is whether or not you incorporate South America into that. I say no. In the next 15 years, maybe you start to see that. But right now, there's the West. And the West is against what is essentially like the Slavic world, Russia, you know. And then there's the Sinic world. That's China. That's a whole different civilization that they don't get along, but they understand that they can get along if up against the West. And just like Russia, it's trying to figure out how many of these former Soviet bloc countries, how many of these Slavic countries will permit being in the Russian sphere of influence. They rolled the dice and said that can be Ukraine, and we're seeing that occur right now. But you need to conceptualize this as a civilizational struggle occurring in a pivot area that has geopolitical significance for the entirety of Eurasia, for the entire continent. And it has never really occurred that one power has controlled the entire continent, but it could. And it's always occurred that when Russia has gotten close a few times, Russia has gone right up into the edge of becoming big and significant enough that it could just pile drive Europe. But then usually when that happens, there's enough unity among the other powers that they can unify momentarily to contain Russia. This is the containment strategy. You'll hear, containment theory brought up a lot, but just to make sense of what's going on, like you're seeing a demographic civilizational fight that things start to make a lot more sense once you view it like that. Like it's not just Putin. It's not just one guy. It's not one megalomaniac. If you take the farther view of history, it really is the same war. And people will say, like, maybe his motivation isn't specifically that. Maybe this history, this geopolitical reality, isn't animating their exact decisions. But the idea is that if you are of a people, if you are of a civilization, that's almost your biological drive. It's like, it's crazy to think that there's a part of the world, this crescent frontier zone, that demands to be conquered. Like if you live in that area, you're never not being conquered. That's the story of Eastern Europe. For Eastern Europeans out there, like I'm half Ukrainian, but it's like, yeah, your destiny has always been throughout time, like being invaded for this very same reason, And one must wonder is there a way? I don't think there's a way out of that. This is why I don't think there is a true multipolar world. I think it's a nice idea. I think if you had it arranged by an artificial intelligence that controlled all the nukes, maybe you could do it. But there is no reality where, like, if America falls, it's not right back to it again. It's not Asia. It's not China trying to take over the entirety of Asia and wield that, making a fortress, and then Russia trying to invade that entire crescent region and wield that against Europe, because that's been happening for 500 years, And in this sense, nations don't matter. The borders don't really matter. The borders actually only make sense within the context of that. Anyway, he explains it very, very well here. Just a second. He said basically, the largest landmass is two huge population areas: Europe, which is the legacy of Rome, and Indo-Asia, separated by a belt of seas and a belt of deserts. 2/3 of the global population resides here, and these two civilizations differ in every single detail. Now, some people would split, the Indo-Asia up into two different civilizations, but it is interesting how the geography and the mountain ranges and the seas themselves kind of bookend these, and the terrain itself informs the character of a civilization. And he says this one line here I really love. He says, "History is to a great extent one long comment on the importance of East-West trade, and this trade is defined by geographic bounds." Now, there's one problem with this book, and it was written in early 20th century, and he makes some predictions about what he thinks is going to happen in the future, and some of these I think were kind of proven wrong. For example, he makes the claim that he doesn't believe America and Russia will remain in Germany for very long after World War II. because these are a series of lectures that were written around World War II, and he's like, okay, Germany's been conquered, but it's not like Russia and America are gonna like battle each other over Germany or anything like that. And that's like, it sounds like he couldn't really see the Cold War coming.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.